Hi, everyone, and welcome to another special episode of Production Value Matters, the business events podcast. We're doing guide episodes with my friend, Michael Lee Hooper. Mike, it's good to see you again. How have you been doing lately?
Thank you, and thank you for having me. I've been doing great.
So, on today's episode, guide episode, I should say, we are talking about working with in-house AV suppliers, which, you know, has its advantages and disadvantages. We're going to make sure that we're not doing an industry lament in this episode, but really offering some practical tips for the listeners to understand how best to leverage their position with those in-house suppliers, when to use an in-house supplier, because I think that there are some very applicable situations, and when not to, and how you can navigate some of the minefields around that. And I don't know if you're going to be at the Canadian Meeting and Events Expo, but we're also doing a live recording with Heather Reed from Planner Protect, where we're going to talk about some of those contract issues.
Cool.
So I don't really want to get into like, well, if you see this clause, we'll get to that in a further episode. But both of us have been and are third party production companies and producers. We've both worked for big AV companies that have or have not had in-house contracts as part of their business. So we've both been on sort of both sides of the equation. But full disclosure, if you're listening to this episode, that we are now third parties. We're now on the outside, as it were. And so, we've had some particular dealings with some in-house companies, and positive and negative. And so I just want to give that disclosure before we get into the episode. I'm sure my lawyers are very happy that I just said that out right. So why don't we start with talking about, we're just going to sort of mention the elephant in the room. Like there's one big, massive company that has, especially in Canada and across the United States, a larger than representative portion of the market for in-house contracts. And so we're gonna we all know who we're talking about, but we certainly don't want to make this all about them. Uh, but I want to sort of give the audience a little bit of a background on how we got here and how that sort of developed. Because 10 years ago it wasn't the case, right? There was a smattering of different companies all over the place who were all sort of competing, and now I'd say 75% of the in-house market is owned by one company. And yeah, so why don't you start us off with your sort of perspective on how we got there?
Well, I mean, I'm not, well versed in like the whole development of all of the business in North America, but I sort of lived through what went down in Canada, in Toronto specifically, with the juggernaut that is PSAV purchasing up basically a heap of the companies around here, the FMAV, which was Frischkorn, and then Media, and also MediaCo, is just this big massive conglomeration, basically buying their way into a bunch of venues. And I think that's sort of like, honestly, that's the limit of my knowledge. Like that's over. I was through that where PSAV bought a bunch of stuff and became Encore. Freeman was one of them as well. Uh, and then suddenly it was at least the same letterhead everywhere. I think
Yeah.
the people in those venues largely stayed the same, from my recollection, but it was the letterhead changed, and the contracting policies and the in-house agreements adapted, I think, a bit.
Yeah, absolutely. I was certainly witness to that in Canada, and it also happened throughout the States a little bit. Like, there was some conglomeration and some large scale institutional investment firms came in and saw an opportunity to consolidate the market a little bit. So
Mm.
it happened to an extreme effect here in Canada, where, as you said, there were little companies sort of like merging into one, and then they got acquired, and then another one acquired their parent company, and all of a sudden they woke up one day and realized, oh, we have all the in-house contracts.
there's this game
T-shirt changed to the same one, right?
there's this game that you play with earth magnets. I don't know if you've ever seen it, but you put like a looped string on the table and a bunch, and the goal is to put like earth magnets in places and trick the other person into like sucking them all up. And that's in my brain, that's sort of what happened. It's like one investment group like placed their earth magnet, and suddenly like 17 just went into one big like mass of organizations.
Yeah, yeah, and one of the curiosities in the Canadian market was that when PSAV, oh, I can't remember if it was it's changed so many names, over the scope, but Freeman Audiovisual was a secondary offshoot of another company out of the United States, and when they acquired the company in the United States, they didn't they actually hadn't realized that they also picked up Freeman Audiovisual Canada, and so they 'cause it was a separate entity from Freeman Audiovisual in the US, and so they didn't acquire the US entity, but they accidentally acquired the Canadian entity. They had no idea it was on the books, and then all of a sudden they said, "Oh, huh, I guess we own everything now." And so I always thought that that story was funny. Okay, so,
Mm.
that's where we are now, right? Is that it still to this day, and some of that has been changing over the last few years. There are, a couple of companies out west have started to break that near monopoly of that sort of big conglomerate, and started to take on in-house contracts for major convention centers, and we're starting to see that trend sort of break up a little bit. I think naturally out of a market demand, and positioning, but we're still at a point where, anecdotally, 80% of the market is owned by one company. And so, I imagine a lot of event planners and event organizers still feel sort of intimidated about how to work with in-house AV suppliers, and maybe not 100% and knowing what their options are. And so I wanted to shift the conversation into really a practical guide to working with the, in-house AV companies, because I personally believe that there is a real advantage to certain aspects of having an in-house provider. There are definitely circumstances where it is of great advantage to the buyer, whoever that might be, to use in-house services. I also think that there are times when the in-house has no business being involved in certain aspects of a show or an event, and so you know, I guess my question is, what is your take on the sort of general idea of using in-house AV, and how do you like to work with them?
So I think like you just sort of mentioned, and I'm gonna try not to be so much of like the two of us being in like just constant agreement in this conversation because I go that's just a really boring. But I think yeah, there are definitely some instances where it makes perfect sense, and you really should work with the in-house company. And it's not, and I just want to be clear, it's like I've worked in a bunch of venues in the last couple of years, and I want to say only 50% of them have been encore. Uh, you work in some other places, particularly around Toronto, and you've got some smaller providers that are the in-house group. And I think I want to point out two things. One is that the encore that does the big events is not the same encore that does the in-house services. The AV providers, largely that I've experienced anyway, that provide the in-house services at these venues are not the same ones that you would use for a massive gala. They've just not set up that way. Um, so my experience has been sort of that, sort of almost across the board. And there are very few venues that I've been in where it's strictly in-house. You have to go with the in-house. And those venues are like the ones where if you touch the wrong thing, suddenly you owe the venue $500,000 because you've just broken the Portland vase or something.
Sure, yeah.
It's like museums and like high security areas where they only allow certain people into the building.
Mhm.
Everywhere else, they're sort of the language that they use is very much, well, you have to use our in-house provider. But if you look at your contract, it's really, you don't have to, you just pay an extra fee in the venue. So, um, that's sort of what my experience has been. It's been sort of, I want to say, like a mix of great experiences with in-house and less great when things were more sophisticated, if that makes any kind of sense.
Yeah, absolutely. Look, I am of the, and again, not to turn this into like we agree with everything, but I there is a really solid case for using in-house services, and I think that there are two main situations. The one I always talk about is bringing in power. I always personify it as, I'm walking into their house, someone's house, right? Like if I walked into your house and I started nailing pictures to the wall and plugging things in your living room,
Mm,
you'd be like, "What are you doing?" Like, and I thoroughly believe that um that is an exclusive service. It should be in-house. I love working with rigging and power teams for whatever in-house provider. Here, yes. So we've been talking about Encore as one of the sort of key players, but there's also like Showtech and various other sort of rigging and power vendors, and they're amazing. They're lovely people. They're very helpful. We can send them a drawing and say, "Hey, this is what we were thinking. We're pretty sure the math works out." And they come back with better ideas. I've had amazing experiences with Encore in venues across North America where, we're sort of an hour behind on something, and we've got this complex rigging thing to do. And their head rigger comes out and says, "Nah, I got this." And he like straps on a
mm,
harness like a superhero, jumps over with a rope and, parallel rappels down the thing and fixes it with like a wrench in his teeth, and I'm like, "You're my superhero," right? It's when and I think I want to capitalize on the point that you made that they're like, I'm just calling out Encore as an example. Encore is divided into, I think, 3 different service areas, and they sometimes get, convoluted and thrown together, and I think that's where on a service and a service expectation side from clients and from the industry as a whole, when they get conflated like that is where that friction starts, right? And understanding that. And those three to me are the power and rigging in-house, taking care of the walls and the outlets. 100%. I think it's a great idea. Um, the sort of service level in-house, AV provider, and equipment supplier, and then the show production
mm,
side, right? And I've worked with all 3, on various scales of shows, and, when you go into, the Hilton blah, 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 blah in, Wisconsin, right? And you're expecting the show production team out of LA or wherever they're based, you're not getting that, and so but then when that sort of on the ground AV service level is expected to act as that production company, that's where it falls apart. Clients get really frustrated. They're especially wondering why they're paying such high prices for that
mm,
deliverable. And so, this is where I think it's really essential and, not to self promote too much, but it's really essential to use production companies to help navigate, right?
mm,
What those sort of 3 arms and how you're leveraging those in the execution of your event. Unfortunately, I think sometimes that sort of middle service level, like of the in-house AV service provider, it comes across as, "Don't worry, we're also that
mm,
big production company." And without pulling the resources from, Encore Global, and their production team, they're really not. And so that's where, I will always advise clients that, look, power and rigging, you need to get from the in-house, whether it's Encore or not, and you gotta use them. And yes, we'll help you negotiate prices and all of those things, but I'm not trying like, there's no like, we had a client recently who was like who wanted to do some really complex rigging, And I was like, I'm not touching that with a 10-foot pole. It's their house. It's their
Mhm.
beam structure. It's their engineers. Like they know. And yes, we're going to keep them honest about what they're charging you. But, there's really no point in us trying to leverage that. But I will tell a client that, hey, you're putting up a gigantic LED screen. You need a production company.
Mm.
You do like even if you're going to rent the stuff from
Mm.
the in-house, you need a production company to be able to know how to use that. Don't assume it's
Yeah.
the big global production team, right?
Yeah, and that's I mean, trying not to be negative about this because it wasn't actually a negative experience. It just sometimes when I talk about this, it sounds like it was a bad, horrible day. I did an event in a venue downtown, a hotel downtown Toronto. I want to say about a year ago, year and a half ago. And so there was a thing that bothered me about the last AV company I worked for. And the thing about it was that from a client's point of view, they were receiving a very disjointed kind of experience. So I was sales manager and there were project managers. And then the model that they used was they would talk to the sales manager to the point where a contract was signed. And then that guy would bugger off and you'd never hear from that guy again until it was time to reconcile at the end. And everything was being dealt with by a project manager. And that was similar to my experience at this venue in Toronto, where I was dealing with the house guy, the
Mhm.
house venue rep, um, the AV rep for the venue. I want to be clear. It wasn't like the hotel person passed me off to somebody. It was there's the AV rep at the hotel, up to a point where he said, "This is too much for me." And then suddenly I was dealing with somebody else who didn't know the venue, but knew production, but didn't know the venue. And it was a very kind of disjointed kind of thing. And the house guy didn't come back on the conversation until we were on site. And then I want to be clear, he solved some problems for me on site that
Mhm.
were not the cause of the in-house venue. It was like there was literally like stuff that we were like, you know what? This is darker than I would like it to be in this hallway. I need to fix this and I need to fix this like now. And he was like, "Oh yeah, sure. I got some stuff down here, and we'll just pull this out, and we'll make it happen for you." It was great. So it was actually a lovely experience. But the disjointed kind of relationship between the in-house and then the more sophisticated production team was sort of it was a thing that needed to be navigated. And if it had been my event planner client dealing with that themselves, I think she would have lost her mind. Um, just because there were at that point, she wouldn't I was barely keeping hold of who I needed to be talking to make things go, because I needed to navigate the conversation between essentially the two disparate departments.
Mhm.
Um, so that's where I think having a project manager, having a production company involved sort of helped to bridge that gap.
Yeah.
If yeah.
So, let's talk about situations where, again, we sort of mentioned power and rigging. I think that's like, whoever the in-house is, you know, there's really no real advantage. Maybe price advantage, but we're talking about stepping over a dime to pick, or picking, stepping over a dollar to pick up a dime. You know what I mean? Like it, like this is a battle that I wanna die, the hill that I wanna die on. There are times I think when it is of enormous advantage for, an event organizer to use the in-house. And, I don't wanna sort of pigeonhole all of these situations into one big bucket,
Mhm.
but they tend to be we have a one-day event where, we're presenting, an hour worth of slides, and then we're going to lunch kinda thing, right? Like a breakout room or a sort of line of drape, up lights, 2 screens, and a podium kinda thing. And I think that there are great advantages to using in-house for that. And, I get a call from a client every once in a while, says, "Hey, I'm going to, the Hilton downtown Toronto, and we got 50 people in a room. Do you wanna
Mm.
quote on an AV?" And I'm like, "No." For the price premium that you're gonna get in that venue, for the headache it's gonna cause, for me to move things around from my warehouse to that venue and set it up and, argue with the hotel rep who wants to get the commission and all that kind of it's really not worth anybody's headache here. So, we were just pitching a large conference down in the States where the in-house provider had made this enormous event investment of some very specialized equipment for these relatively small breakout room spaces, I should say. And they embedded some speakers and some cabling in the walls and all of those kind of things. And I said, like, I know you want to try and get a better price for the breakout equipment, but really, like, for the headache it's going to cause you for getting the stuff into the venue and the staffing and so on and so on, where, you can just go into that venue and say, "Hey, I want to activate room 1 through 5," and it's all on a Crestron touch button panel. Go do that. It's going to be a little bit, like, technically more expensive, but you're just never gonna have to worry about it, right? Like, all of that kind of stuff. And I don't wanna pull our creative teams and our production teams off of concentrating on the main room that's gonna have, 7,500 people in it, and gigantic LED screens and moving light fixtures and everything. So why don't like, there's a great advantage, and as a organizer and planner, you can leverage that because that in-house, again, put so much financial investment into that. They really wanna get as much revenue from that as possible. So, if you come in and say, "Hey, I've got, 60 breakout rooms, and they're gonna be running for 3 days," you know, no contest, just go and give them that scope of the
Mhm.
contract, right?
Well, I think that's something that not I think enough people are fully aware of is that these venues, they turn over a certain kind of event like by the score. So like your standard wedding, let's say your average wedding, and I don't think anyone would like to be used either of those words to describe their wedding, but I mean, ultimately there are only so many ways to skin a cat physically, or breakout rooms, or like your quick and dirty, say, two screen special.
Mhm.
These larger venues, a lot of the hotels and the conference centers, they are built specifically to be able to serve those things. So you'll find that they have all that stuff built into the walls and into the ceiling. And at that point, you're right. It doesn't make sense to duplicate efforts, bring in another 16 by 9 screen to go in front of the roll down 16 by 9 screen that some lovely integrations company has put into the ceiling.
Yeah.
Maybe the projector needs an upgrade. Maybe it doesn't. Whatever. There's one there. You can check it out, see how if it works for you. But like they're set up to be able to turn these things around very quickly. So if you're looking at saving, say, budget on time, uh, then that makes perfect sense. You can roll in at 9 a.m. in the morning. There was an event there until midnight the night before, and you've got next to no setup to do. And if you're super lucky, there was already someone there doing that exact same thing the day before. So it's already there, and
Yeah.
you can walk in
Yeah, they
and
just
just check it
changed the
out.
linens and
Yeah.
refreshed the coffee and water. Yeah, that being said, you know, I think some planners get into a little bit of trouble when they start to personify that as so turnkey,
Mm,
to your point, where there was something going on in that room until midnight last night, and we rolled in at 9 a.m., right?
mm,
And so there's a mismatch of expectation there and something to be managed, which is, and again, this is where I think production companies and technical experts, as part of the overall team, are really vital. That to like, I don't ever want any of my event planning or organizing clients to ever worry about that. And so I will always put, like, even if the in-house is doing all of the breakout rooms and they
mm,
are providing the equipment and the operators and stuff, I'm still going to put a person on my team whose whole responsibility is to monitor um uh uh manage that aspect of the entire event. Sometimes a lot of planner clients will say, "Oh, well, that's one of our coordinators and named Julie," right?
mm,
And you know, absolutely a great contribution to the team, but they don't always have the technical knowledge to keep them honest,
mm.
and to keep them on task,
Yeah.
right? And so, having a technical expert who can, because I think a lot of event planners get into this thing where they walk in at sort of 8:30 in the morning, and they go, "Oh, hey, it looks set up great," and then they walk away,
Mm,
and then they get tons of calls from speakers going like, "I don't, where's my dongle?" and all that kind of stuff. Which always everybody uses the term dongle, and I always find it a little dirty. Anyway, the so this is where I think a production expert or a technical expert can be part of that team.
mm,
I think then can walk in and do the due diligence of sort of anticipating those technical problems before they show up. So I think that's a vital part of the thing there. Um, I want to go and talk about we've been talking a lot about like, hey, there's some advantages to using the in-house. I also think that there are great advantages to not using in-house, and again, I think it. I'm not going to say that it's more often than not or anything, but there's that problem where those three sort of business units of that in-house sort of conglomerate supplier are not congruent to what you're trying to do in that venue. In the example of the sort of AV supplier and the sort of global production team, and that sort of mismatched expectation that may have been communicated. And so, what are your thoughts on when you should not be using the in-house AV supplier, like as a general rule?
yeah. Well, I don't want to like spend too much time on our first talk, but I think there's one more advantage that we haven't really talked about. We have hinted at it in talking about, quick turnovers for things, but I think there's an advantage that we don't consider enough. And this is maybe um, part of the mentality of having come from an AV company that wasn't in-house everywhere. But
Mhm.
an advantage that I have found personally, now that I've been independent for a while, is that if I am dealing with the in-house company and there is someone there the day before, there's someone at venue, I can reduce costs by coordinating through the in-house company with that other client to optimize my design to come as close to whatever was in-house. Like I've had them leave the rigging out for me, for example. They've got this rigging design. I'll design my show around that. It'll save 4 hours of rigging. Uh, and maybe we split the equipment cost or something like that. So that's a thing that you can't do with an outsourced supplier because it's not their gear that's in there the day before, most likely.
Yeah, for sure.
Um, so anyway, I wanted to touch on that because that's something that I've actually had a lot of success with.
Oh, great. Yep.
Well, a couple of times, done it a couple of times. Yeah, it happened lots, but it was very successful the couple of times I did it. Um, when should you consider not working with the in-house provider? I think this is a judgment call based on who the provider is, because it's not always Encore. I want and like that's the thing. Like it's not always on. But I think it makes sense to know the capabilities of who is really in house. Like in the instance that I outlined before, where I was dealing with the Encore venue, um, uh, it made sense for us to work with Encore's production team. It would have made more sense if the in-house guy had the same capabilities as the Encore production team. That could have been much slicker. Uh, I've worked in the art gallery in Toronto, where you have to have at least one of the in-house vendors people on site. But the event that I was doing was outside of their capabilities. They would have ended up cross-renting everything, including finding the people to run it. So we bring in my people, I rent the gear, we bring it in. Uh, and it was outside of their normal scope, if that makes any kind of sense. Like the stuff that they are set up to do turnkey. Um, and often I want to say in my experience anyway, and this might not be across the board, but often the in-house providers for many of these boutique venues are not large scale AV companies. They're used to doing like the smaller weddings or cross renting 50 laptops from CCR and helping out with a sort of a license plate stamping conference. So if you are doing a project with a design that
Mhm.
is more than two screens and a black backdrop, then I think that's you really want to take a hard look at what the in-house capabilities really are and not just what they put on the website.
Mhm.
Um, and then consider your other options for outside of that. If you've got someone that you like to work with that can do that, they might be someone I would go with. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I wanna sort of capitalize on that capabilities point, right? And you sort of hit on, I think something that people experience all the time, and again, it goes to that goes back to that conflagration of capabilities of a sort of larger organization that's split in 3. That, even the smaller AV companies that are running in-house deals, like, they do potentially have that capability, right? I can think of, mom and pop AV company, gets a contract for the Hilton in, some minor market. They've put a team in place into that venue to serve that, you know, pretty standard event setup, uh, that they'll do, out of 365 days of the year, they're doing that maybe 2 to 300 days,
Mhm.
or 250 days, out of the year. And it's the other 100 or so days that they sort of need to go outside of that, right? And so understanding that capability of that in-house provider, and and really, looking through the marketing detail, right? And 'cause this has happened to me a couple of times with, big AV company that's running the in-house deal, and, we know that they do not have the inventory to support it. They don't have the team.
Mhm.
They don't have, the expertise. They're going to subcontract the entire thing, right? And I think you just mentioned that specific deal, or specific instance where, the you knew that they didn't have the capability to do this, and you knew that they were gonna subcontract. So, at which point, I would love in this industry a little bit of honesty, and I got it one time, which is amazing. I was going into a large conference center in the US, and Encore was the provider, and, we got a mandate from the client because they had a relationship with Encore, they wanted to use them. I said, "Yeah, absolutely, we get it. We're here to, design the show and manage it for you." And we sent the requirements to the rep and said, "Okay, like, you guys are gonna provide all of this." And I got a phone call from the in-house rep, like 10 minutes later saying, "We cannot do this. We do not have the capabilities to do it." And so we went back to the client and said, "Look," with Encore, and we said, "Look, we're like, this is the reality of what you want to do in this room with the team available. We're gonna have to fly people in. We're gonna either have to, like, bring our team in to do it, bring external suppliers in to fulfill it, or we have to go to the bigger global team and get them to do it," right? And it worked out great. It was a fantastic show. We worked with Encore, we worked with sub-suppliers, we
Mhm.
worked with some of our suppliers, and it came together as an amazing show. Everybody was super happy about
Mhm.
it. That's when it really works out, when there's flexibility, when there's understanding, when, you're really concentrating on the end product, which is a really amazing event. And however we get there, we're not super precious about it. Let's just get there, right?
Yeah.
And, in contrast, we've had a recent experience with an in-house contract where they had a very, very specific, weird, exclusivity on one specific department, of lighting, in this particular venue. And or moreover, in a room in a venue, rather than the venue itself. And the in-house was very unreasonable. They were, we would have expected that, we could say, "Okay, well, look, we get it. This is your contract. You guys signed this with the venue. This has been in
Mhm.
place for many years. We understand. We'll adjust what scope that we're handling and give that scope to you as part of your exclusivity." And what they came back with was literally 450%, premium on, so 4.5 times higher than any other market vendor. At which point, like, I can understand clients and planners wanting to just scream into a pillow at this because they don't understand how this could possibly be. And what that is specifically to your point, that is an example of they did not have the capacity to do it. They knew that they didn't have the capacity to do it,
Mm.
and so they subcontracted the whole thing, and by doing that, they had to mark it up enough that they hit their revenue targets per their bosses and hit their commissions to the venue and all of that kind of things, which are, they are what they are at this point. And so, they could have just been honest and said, "Hey, we can't really do this. Like, we'll make an exception to the contract because, it's going to make it cost per like." And what we ended up doing is moving the show because it just we couldn't make it work. And we wanted to. We were like, here, like, so here's the, and I'm going to use arbitrary numbers for demonstration. Like, the lighting package on this whole show would have been 100K. So we were going to give you 100K to fulfill it for us, right? But then they said, and then they marked it up to 450K. And we said, look, we could rent another venue for that, right?
Mm.
So we did.
Mhm.
Like, it was cheaper to pay cancellation fees and move on to a different venue
Mhm.
than it was to deal with that. And so, that's where those disconnects. And I totally understand that any meeting planner or organizer is sitting there going, this is unacceptable. And how do we get out of this kind of
Mm.
thing?
And I think there's another instance where I personally would consider going to another provider as when there isn't a single in-house company. And by that, I don't mean like we've got three options for you, which is like, I think the deal at Arcadian Court in Toronto, where you can use Encore or somebody else, whoever's got deals with OOB. Um, the convention center, you mentioned that earlier, I think. Convention center, I think, has three separate contracts for three different areas of expertise. They've got Showtech for lighting and rigging. Um, they've got Encore for, let's say, general AV. So I've actually gone to the convention center with RFPs and saying, I'm I'm sourcing this. I would like to do this event at the convention center. Could you have your people do it? And I got, three separate quotes back from three different vendors. I think GES was the third. Um,
Yeah.
and that personally, I find to be a pain
Mm.
because I don't know if they're coordinating internally. So that means that's more work for me. I like going with either dividing it up myself, so I've got people I trust. So like we talked about this before, where you know I'll get all my lighting from a lighting specialty company. I'll get all the video wall from everyone that everyone in Toronto gets video wall from. Um, that kind of thing. So I know I've got the specialists, as opposed to like a weird half of the contract going to Showtech and a weird half of the contract going to Encore. And then drapery's going to come from GES. So now I've got to coordinate the in-house's three venues or three providers.
Yeah.
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 As opposed to coordinating my own providers who speak my shorthand. Um,
Sure.
and we can, I find that easier for me, and it's worth
Yeah.
maybe the landmark fee to take that stress off my plate.
Yeah, absolutely. And let's talk about landmark fee for a second because sometimes those can be just as egregious as the
Mm.
as pricing, right? And so, you know, the the way I always like to look at it is a landmark fee um it's sort of economically the same as using the in-house for the breakouts, right? That yes, you're paying a little bit of a premium, but then you're like, how much more worth it to you, time or money, right? Like, and just on a personal anecdote, I was just on vacation in New York and I saw a hat at a vendor. It was like $15 for the hat, and my wife was like, "Oh, hey, there you could get this for $10 over in this part of town, right?" I was like, "Yeah, but we're gonna take the time to take a subway all the way over there to get a hat for $5 cheaper. Like my time is worth much more than that $5, right? So I'm gonna pay that extra $5 to put a hat on my head right now, right?" Side note, it was a piece of garbage. It fell apart in 2 seconds, but whatever. I needed a hat to cover my bald head. It
Mm.
was hot, right? So, that's the economic argument that I always make with clients. I say, look, yes, like it's this landmark fee, which you can negotiate down. You can, you have the leverage and the power here to go back to your venue and say, we're not paying this, or we're paying a reduced amount, or whatever, like a reasonable amount. But the time and effort that will be saved by doing that, I think is enormous. Because again, in your example of, hey, now I have to coordinate with 3 vendors in this venue that I have no relationship with, or working knowledge about. I have to do all that paperwork for just like, I could save so much time by emailing my 3 vendors and saying, hey guys, I need this on Thursday. And they'll be like, yeah, no problem, Hooper, we'll see you soon. Right. Rather than, hey, could you fill out this form in triplicate and so on. And so, it's that balance of time and money that I think is a real advantage of using that third party, even if you are paying some landmark fee.
Mhm. Yeah, absolutely.
Right. So, unfortunately, we're running out of time. We could talk about this for days upon days. As you know, we have talked about this for years upon years at this point. So it's hard to summarize all that experience in a half hour or 40-ish minute podcast. So thank you, Mike, for joining me on this guide episode. And for those of you listening, we will be airing some really great live on location episodes from the Canadian Meetings and Events Expo in the coming weeks. And so this will probably be airing after that episode, after we've been there. But hopefully you'll get a good listen to that great episode coming up with Heather Reed on contract negotiations for a little bit more insight on how you can work with the in-house. Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Mike.
Thank you.
Production Value Matters, the Business Events Podcast, is brought to you by Byrne Production Services. To learn more about Byrne Production Services and how we can achieve your business goals with meaningful event designs and elevated production value, head over to byrneproductionservices.com. For tailored AV consulting, check out theavadvisor.com, where you can book a free 15-minute consultation. Also, be sure to search for Production Value Matters, the Business Events Podcast, and subscribe on your favorite podcast platform. Thanks for listening.